We now look at this incredibly complex story of Syria, which has been off the pages of the Western media for a while. It's suddenly back with a vengeance as Donald Trump gave a green light to President Erdogan of Turkey to invade Syria, which they did this week with airstrikes and now ground troops. We're joined by As'ad Abukhalil, from political scientist from Modesto, California. Assad, welcome back to CN Live.
Thank you, Joe.
I don't know where to begin in this story, Assad, because there's so many different angles on here.
Right.
The Russians, Trump, the relationship with Damascus and the Kurds, the history of the Americans and the Kurds, the fact that we have Republican senators going after Trump and aligning themselves with a Marxist group in in Syria. So, I mean, let's just start where you are with this, and we'll see where we go, because it can begin anywhere.
As you correctly said, there are so many aspects of the story and so many angles. First, it has to be stated that there's a more than an irony that basically Donald Trump has gone on this subject in terms of declaring his insistence on withdrawing from Middle Eastern wars more than his predecessors. And I think the uproar, the hue and cry among the Washington, D.C. elite, the journalists, the think tanks, the human rights merchants, all of those people are freaking out, because these are the lobby of continuous permanent wars in the Middle East. I mean, it is now being exposed more than ever. I mean, if you think about the Trump administration since it started, the only time when this crowd has been pleased with Trump declaring him presidential is when he ordered the bombing of Syria. This president, people on the left, of course, we have so many complaints about Trump and so on. But as far as foreign policy is concerned, I think he's sticking to Rand Paul's foreign policy, which is the traditional Republican foreign policy that preceded the rise of Ronald Reagan. And that foreign policy had many elements, but largely was described as isolationism. The deviation that Trump has from that policy, of course, is his strong support for Israel, which used to be not the position of the Republican Party in pre-Ronald Reagan. I think the alarm that is happening now has been very expressly, stated by some of the Obama officials. I mean, look at the Twitter account of the former ambassador of the United States in Israel at the time of the Obama administration, Don Shapiro, and he basically is stating like Israel is not happy with that. So many commentators are expressing alarm that Israel is not happy with this step, as if American foreign policy should be dictated by what is decided by Israel or not. But I think that clearly Trump wants to wash off his hand from Middle Eastern wars, with the exception of his continued support for Israeli aggression and wars whenever they decide, and for the Saudi war in Yemen. So it is not really a total withdrawal from Middle Eastern affairs, but it is from certain wars. And while I have been reading about the occupation in Syria by the Turkish government, how come nobody is mentioning that American troops are in occupation of Syria as well? And they continue to be there against the expressed wishes, I would say, of the Syrian people, of the government in Syria, whether one likes it or not. But it cannot be said that, like in the case of Iraq, the government of Iraq has accepted the deployment of US troops and so on. What the Turkish government wants, basically, Erdogan domestically is not doing well. His political party has been slumping in the polls. He has serious competitors, and there is rising climate of not only complaints, but also even of racism against the Syrian refugees in Turkey. And the opposition has been blaming Erdogan for that mess. And they basically have been calling for better relationship with the Syrian government and for the return of the Syrian refugees. And you hear these complaints as well in Lebanon. So I think that he wants to get rid of the Syrian refugees, and certainly not in a pretty way. He doesn't care about what's going to happen to them once they are thrown across the border. But he wants to create an area under his control where he can resettle these Syrian refugees. As far as the press talking about the Syrian Democratic Forces and all that stuff, I mean, this is what America does around the world, right? Since before even the Second World War. The United States creates surrogate militias around the world and then bestows legitimacy on these militias and then says, those militias have invited us to interfere in those countries where they operate. I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces is really nothing but an American surrogate militia, has been armed, financed, and supported by the United States, notwithstanding the presence of a contingent of Kurdish communists. I mean, so much for that communism that is aligned with American imperialism, right? I mean, people in the region are scoffing at this communism. But most importantly, I mean, the United States cobbled together a so-called coalition of Arabs. I mean, the Syrian Democratic Forces, basically, the United States paid people for hire. These are mercenaries hired by the United States government in order to fight with the Kurdish rebels to give a certain air of a collective Syrian Arab Kurdish alliance against ISIS. Now, also it has to be stated, American media have gone, especially in the last 24 hours, wildly in exaggeration of the role that these militias played in the defeat of ISIS. Left unsaid in all this reportage is that the foes of the United States, the enemies of the United States, has really done the bulk of the fighting and the dying against ISIS, whether it's in Syria or in Iraq, and in Lebanon as well, because Hezbollah has taken upon itself the bulk of the fight against ISIS on the border and against Al-Qaeda in Syria. But of course, there is a myth now being created that it's all these rebels that are armed and financed by the United States who have done the defeat of ISIS.
Yes, I noticed that as well. Russia is left out too, by the way.
Of course.
And then without Russia and Iran and Hezbollah and even Iraqi militias and the Kurds, they would never have defeated ISIS. This was not an American operation, despite boasting Trump that we did this, etc. There are, interestingly enough, a bunch of American officials, including senators, saying that Rubio, of all people, I don't think I'd ever quote Marco Rubio, that the Kurds did all our fighting, at least in that area, against ISIS, and we can't abandon them. Now, you said Trump, yes, wants to withdraw, and he's taking on a kind of a Rand Paul policy on this, except for Yemen and Israeli aggression. But he really didn't withdraw from Syria. I mean, he tried. He twice announced he would, and they didn't. He's withdrawing several miles back from the border to allow the Turks to invade. Now, I just want to know two things from you. One, what do you think took place in that conversation between Erdogan and Trump on the phone on Sunday when when Erdogan got Trump to give the green light? And bring us around the region for the regional perspective on this. Each country, what are they thinking in the Gulf? What are they thinking elsewhere?
Right. I mean, the thing is, I mean, you indicated how he has still not withdrawn American troops from Syria. There's still something like 1,000 troops there that we know of. Probably there's additional CIA operatives that are not listed in that count, of course. But it should be also mentioned, this reality, how Donald Trump wanted to withdraw US forces from Afghanistan. He was not allowed to do that. He wanted to withdraw US troops from Iraq and from Syria. He was not allowed. This tells you that there is an empire. There is a national security state. And no matter how powerful you are, no matter whether you are elected as a president of this country, there are limits to what you can do. I mean, Francois Mitterrand in France said in the 1980s when asked, the thing that surprised him the most was the little you can do to make change. This is in France, where General de Gaulle in 1958 created a very powerful, dynamic presidency. I mean, talk about the United States, we talk about imperial presidency. When it comes to national security, there are limits to what the president can do, and they have been resisting him all along. I mean, I don't think that it is in Trump's imagination that there is a war by the intelligence community against Trump. I mean, bulk of the leaks against Trump in the Washington Post and the New York Times, this is really the intelligence community fighting back. They just don't like Trump for for many reasons, and they are fighting back in their own way, in a very powerful way. And I think this shows the naivety of Trump, somebody who has never served in office before. He's been unaware of the power of these agencies if you ever antagonize him. I mean, look, since at least John F. Kennedy, there was an intention by the US president to expel, to retire J. Edgar Hoover. And not one of them was able to do that. Not him, not J. F. Kennedy, not LBJ, not Richard Nixon. I mean, he died in office, as we know. I mean, compare that to the power of the 17 intelligence agencies we have today with $64 billion budget and with an extremely incestuous relationship with the US media, especially the Washington Post. And that creates an atmosphere where they are able to activate so much noise against the intention of a president who wants to pull back from the role of empire of the United States. They don't want that. Now, the United States certainly, I mean, there are certain calculations on the part of Trump that one may know or may not know about, because I just read something about Lindsey Graham had a conversation with hoaxers from Russia in which he talked about some bank deals for Trump and so on. I mean, I don't know about that, but let us say that there is a resistance in Congress among Republicans, in the media, and of course, public opinion is certainly to follow. In the region, however, there is as well a lot of criticisms and rejections, especially by the Saudi camp. And Saudi government, of course, controls the bulk of the Middle East region order, political order, the regime order, the despotic order, we should say. Saudi Arabia is a regional rival of Turkey. They both are after the mantle of leadership of the Islamic people. And Turkey has been scoring successes, especially in the last 2 decades, especially by its championing of the Palestinians when the Saudi regime has been championing Zionism in the region. All that has whetted the appetite of Erdogan to pose as, I don't want to use the cliches of the Ottoman Sultan and all that, but there is a bit of that. And the discourse of Turkey in the last weeks or so, there's an element of that. And they also have strong, powerful regional allies as well. Do not forget that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is still strong in the region, throughout the region, is allied with Turkey. Qatar is an ally of Turkey, and there are very good relations between Turkey and the Iranian government. So all that adds to the regional divisions and the split, which alarms Saudi Arabia and alarms Israel, because Israel is in the same trench with Saudi Arabia.
So Qatar is backing this Turkish incursion, dependent as they are with Turkey? Sorry?
Not in strong words, but I would say there is implicit acceptance. There is implicit acceptance because they both support the same allies in the Syrian opposition, armed or otherwise. Although both Saudi Arabia and Qatar have pulled back largely from arming the Syrian rebels, and largely because they basically gave up on them in their ability to achieve their successes. But Turkey has now taken up their affair because they want clients inside Syria itself, and they are relying on them to fight, to take the fight. So now we are going to see a situation where Syrian rebels fighting against other Syrian rebels. Some are sponsored by the United States and Gulf countries, and some are going to be sponsored by Turkey. And that's how the reality is going to be. The Syrian Democratic Forces, these clients of the United States, however, now are yelling that they will ask perhaps for an alliance or rapprochement with the Syrian government. So, I mean, in some ways, we can look at this as a fight between an ally of the United States, Turkey, fighting against clients of the United States, the surrogate militias of Syrian Democratic Forces. I mean, that's the irony of it.
I was going to ask you, what are the prospects of a rapprochement between Damascus and the Syrian Kurds?
Very high, very high. I mean, the reality is Kurdish leadership in Iraq, as well as in Syria, as in Lebanon, have been exhibited over the last so many decades, a lot of unprincipled shift and oscillations. And we can argue about this is a fight for survival and they've had very tough odds and so on. All that is true. But on the other hand, there has been very little principled adherence to the set of principles that they both declare, whether you're talking about the Kurdish allies in northern Iraq or now about these allies. I mean, just think about it like this, Joe. Here is a communist group allied with the United States. I mean, there's something wrong with that picture, right?
Yeah.
So if a communist group is willing to align with the United States, it will be less of a stretch in their mind to ally with the Syrian government, with which they were at some point aligned as well.
So they would have to give up their claim of independence and accept some kind of autonomy? Absolutely.
The Syrian government is in no position to give independence to them whatsoever. There is a hardline position still among the Ba'ath in Syria or in Iraq in the past against Kurdish independence goals and aspirations. They may reach a situation of self-autonomy or something like that, but will fall short against them. And listeners should also remember that the PKK, which is a terrorist organization for Israel and for the United States, used to be sheltered in Syria. But once Turkey threatened in the 1990s the Assad regime that they are going to go to war if he does not surrender Öcalan, again, the Syrian government, which is also unprincipled when it comes to its own survival as a regime, they gave up the leader of the, Abdullah Öcalan.
Of the PKK, who's still in prison in an island
Correct.
in the Black Sea, whose life was spared when Turkey gave up the death penalty to try to join the EU. What did Trump? I don't. This is just a speculation because we don't know. This transcript of this conversation hasn't been released. What the great deal maker? What deal did he make with Erdogan to say, okay, go ahead and invade? I don't care. These guys, the Kurds, they didn't back us in World War II. They didn't take part in the Normandy invasion. If you saw that,
right?
I mean, really.
I mean, we cannot, in the case of Trump, spend too much time analyzing what kind of vision he's looking at. I mean, I don't think there's any vision there. I think in his case, he's very impulsive. He's very impressionable about foreign policy. But I think what he really stands for is that he looks in economic terms, as well as in human terms, at the cost of US wars in the region. And it has to be said, in the Iraq war, I remember him as a celebrity when he used to appear on TV and blast the Bush administration, even when Bush was widely popular with Democrats, with the likes of Hillary Clinton. And Trump was a very early voice of cynical opposition to that war, saying it's a terrible thing for the United States. And I should also mention yesterday, it was quite ironic. He was the first president since the war started against Iraq by the United States in 2003 to mention the human civilian cost of the other side. This is never mentioned here in the United States, not by the news media, not by the human rights merchant, and certainly not by the think tank people in Washington, D.C.
No, it's forbidden. And the military has said that they've said they don't count civilian casualties.
They don't do counting.
On the other side, they just don't give a damn.
Which basically means they do counting, they just...
Right. Don't make it public.
Right. They have their own classified estimates.
Now, what about the issue of these Islamic State prisoners that are in prison in the Kurdish area, that the Kurds have said, that they have to abandon controlling that. They're going to have to move forces. Well, they're going to abandon the fight against ISIS now to defend against Turkey. There's big question mark about whether this prison will come under the control of Turkey. Trump said in his statement on Sunday that he wants Turkey to take responsibility for that. And the first thing I thought was Erdogan might just open the doors and let those guys out, given the previous alliance that Turkey had with ISIS, right?
Well, the Europeans don't want it, right? The Europeans are refusing to take back people who've joined ISIS from their own countries.
Right.
And when did they join ISIS? They joined ISIS when European governments and Arab Gulf governments were romanticizing all branches of the Syrian rebels, bestowing such heroic aspects to their struggle in Syria as well. And as a result, they turned a blind eye. Joe, I remember in the American and the Canadian media when they wrote glowing profiles of individuals who decided to leave everything behind and to go join the Syrian rebels. This is when 2011, 12, 13, where they did not want to recognize the reality of the various strands and factions of the Syrian rebels, because all of them were declared at the time as feminists, secularists, Democrats, and so on. So the Europeans don't want them anymore, which basically I think raises a lot of cynical question. Who is keeping them in those prisons and for what purposes? Are they going to be left there for the United States or for the Europeans or for Turkey to use against enemies of these countries in the future? I'm not sure. But the fact that they were left in a state of limbo like that tells me that there is somebody with a very sinister calculation about their plight.
Well, two of them have been removed to a U.S. prison in Iraq, and these were two British big prizes. The one who chopped the head off of an American journalist being one of them.
Right, which raises more questions, right? Of all these thousands of prisoners, the United States is only concerned about those two? What about the rest?
Now, up until now, Idlib was really the last extremely volatile place in Syria. And if that ever resolved itself, this war might come to an end. Now we're opening up a new front here with the Turkish invasion. Is there an attempt, you think, by Turkey and the Gulf Arab states to reanimate an effort to overthrow Assad, or have they given up on that?
I think they've given up on that. I think there are no signs of any rejuvenation of the effort of the Syrian rebels. And you can tell that by the statement of the Syrian rebels, who basically have given up on pinning their hopes on anybody outside of the United States. You still hear that, and Turkey. I mean, they still have a lot of hope about Turkey wanting to rescue them and so on. but Gulf governments are in a very different zone now. And there are now, I mean, I would say there has been indications in the last so many weeks, especially during the United Nations session, the General Assembly, there were, overtures by the Arab League toward the Syrian diplomat, which is very new. The Secretary General of the Arab League, who is a puppet of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, went to the Syrian diplomatic mission and exchanged pleasantries with the Syrian foreign minister. And so this is all new. And they even talked about readmitting Syria. The only thing that's stopping that from happening officially, despite unofficial contacts between Saudi Arabia and Syrian government and between UAE and Syrian government, the only thing stopping that is basically the United States. The United States put brakes on these efforts because a month or two ago, there was already almost an agreement to readmit Syria into the Arab League, which I think could happen, not in this year, but perhaps to 2020. So I don't think there is anybody thinking that there is a potential of bringing down the Syrian government through those rebels. Now, maybe another force, another army, another country, but not through those rebels.
So they've accepted defeat. That's one thing. What is?
No, you'd be surprised.
Uh-huh.
If you read some of their statements, they are still quite very ambitious. I mean, they talk about almost victory around the corner, and they always reorganize themselves and relaunch themselves.
No, I don't mean the rebels. I mean the Gulf states.
The Gulf states.
They've given up. They've given up.
Absolutely. And let's not forget, I mean, they have their own wars to take care of, right? I mean, the Yemen war is sapping so much of the resources.
Now, what do you think Erdogan's ultimate aim is here? Is it going to? He just wants a quick operation to create this safe zone and dump those refugees, even against their will, back to this area that they would then be responsible for? That's it.
I think it is more domestic. I think you want to get rid of the Syrian refugees. He wants to release the pressure on the Turkish economy. He wants to undermine the constant criticism by the opposition against him because they blame him for the mess. And they also even fault him for not having, for ruined relationship with the Syrian government and so on, because they feel that's economically to the detriment of Turkey. For all these reasons, I think he's acting from domestic purposes. As far as some of the Saudi critics who worry about the Sultanate of the Ottoman Empire coming back, I mean, I don't see any evidence of that. I mean, Turkey is very aware that it is not that popular to try to reclaim the mantle of the Sultan of the Islamic Ummah or something like that.
So how has the Saudi-dominated media in the region been reporting this? Is it big news or are they bearing it? Alarm.
With a great alarm. I mean, you'll be surprised. Suddenly, the Saudi government is concerned about civilian casualties in Syria. So there is a lot of attention. I mean, I would say the coverage of Saudi Arabia is very much in tune with Western media coverage. But then again, this is not new. Ever since the Syrian war started, Gulf regime media and Western media are dancing to the same tune. I mean, when I read the Washington Post correspondence about Syria or the New York Times, I mean, it's like reading Saudi newspapers. And some of them write in both, in fact. Like Dennis Ross is a columnist for a Saudi mouthpiece of Mohammed bin Salman. Charles Lister, a well-known advocate of Syrian rebels at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. He has a regular column in the Sharq al-Awsat, the mouthpiece of Mohammed bin Salman, and so on. So articles by Liz Sly, the Washington Post correspondent who covered Syria, is often cited by Gulf media and so on. So there is very close relationship and very similarity and a lot of similarity in coverage.
But are the critics of Trump wrong? Has he not made a blunder here doing this?
Well, I mean, the thing is, look, if there is concern about civilian casualties, where were those people when there has been civilian casualties in Syria for so many years since the war started? Why were they not concerned? So I am not somebody who believed the crocodile tears of this crowd in Washington, D.C. Certainly, however, I mean, for somebody who sympathizes with Kurdish aspirations as I do, and I think for humanity in general, I am not in any way, I do not trust the Turkish government how it is going to handle the Kurd. There's a very long history of brutal mistreatment of Kurds by the Turkish government. I mean, let's not forget, until the 1980s, the Turkish government banned the use of the word Kurd. It used to be officially known as Mountain Turk. So, I mean, there is a history of racism, bigotry, and repression, and one could legitimately worry about that. But on the other hand, do I trust the welfare of the Syrian people to Donald Trump or to Obama or to Bush? I mean, so, I mean, it is, and most importantly, I mean, one of the worst chapters of this war, and in this war, there are no clean hands. There is innocent blood on the hands of the Syrian regime, of the Syrian rebels, of the American government, of the Russians, and so on. But we should also remember that one of the most devastating destruction that took place in Syria was at the hand of the US bombing in Raqqa. I mean, this was a massive humanitarian problem, which received not much attention in the Western world.
Indeed, that's the case. Would you put this decision by Trump in the category, the long litany of times the West, and the US in particular, has sold out the Kurds? It's a familiar line throughout the history. Is this the next chapter in that?
But we should also go further than that and to blame Kurdish leadership. I mean, somebody being fooled once or twice is this Texan proverb about that. I mean, when you are fooled 5, 6, 7, 8 times, what does that mean? And I think the Kurdish people deserve to have much better leadership, people who do not pin their hopes over and over again on the United States or on Israel, let us remember as well, who never gave any concern about the welfare of the Kurdish people, for sure. I think also, look, Trump is not going to be able to achieve what he wants in the Middle East. He wants to pull out of the Middle East. They're not going to let him. I mean, the intelligence, the national security state is more powerful than the presidency. So notice, whenever he pushes against them, they push back. And then he gives in. They push again. I mean, it goes back and forth. So eventually there is going to be some situation where he's going to curtail the Turkish government. He's not going to allow it to go through with their plan because he's going to succumb to the pressures.
Well, is it still possible for him to do that?
I think it is. I mean, he's giving signals on that because after the first announcement, he said, I'm watching what the Turks are doing very closely, and in case it gets out of hand, or if it goes against what I expect or accept, I'm going to fight back and so on.
Yeah.
So
the way he could fight back is Congress apparently has got already legislation to impose sanctions on Turkey.
Correct.
What I read, the reporting says that they have a super majority, so he couldn't even veto that, but he could agree to it. So sanctions could be the way to stop.
Absolutely, and let us remember that the Israeli government is extremely. The Israeli government detests Turkish government and Erdogan. So for that reason, I think AIPAC could act very strongly because AIPAC will pose as an advocate for the Kurds because they like self-determination for people, of course.
In the short term, when it helps them, of course, they helped very much of the Kurds in Iraq. That's well known.
Right.
And then they were abandoned there by George H.W. Bush. And Kissinger abandoned the Kurds too, didn't he, at one point?
Right. And the Israelis as well, of course.
So it's a quite fascinating situation. And one last question, As'ad, thank you for being with us. Amongst the comments from these senators, Republicans and others who are criticizing Trump, is that this helps our enemies, Iran and Russia. Now, that just looks like a big bunch of ignorance about what's going on in this war.
Absolutely.
Just
absolutely.
Rhetoric for domestic consumption, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, the media of Iran and its allies have been very critical, very negative of what is happening. I mean, within a few hours of the announcement of the Turkish operation, a foreign ministry official, a leading one, Al-Lahyan, wrote on Twitter strong criticism, I mean, that we don't believe this is the right thing and so on. So no, I don't think this calculation, but you know, they do that. I mean, Gulf media journalists in Washington, D.C. who write in English on Twitter, like all were saying, oh, this is going to be a victory for Iran, for Hezbollah. I mean, they listed every enemy of the United States and Israel. They just left Lenin out of that list. I mean, it's just not precise what they are saying. No, not.
Well, unfortunately, the American major media parrots that as well. They go right along with that. Everything comes down to Iran and Russia all the time.
And
well,
Assad, Venezuela.
Yeah, they didn't throw the North Koreans in there. What about Cuba? Well, once again, As'ad, thanks for coming on. And you doused some cold water on the alarmism that's surrounding this story. It's almost, you're saying it's not that big of a deal, as many are saying.
No, I mean, I think it is a big deal. And whenever Turkey is, going to war against Kurds, I think one should be concerned. But what I'm saying is the way the Washington, D.C. establishment is acting, it is not out of concern. They just want permanent war in the Middle East by the United States, permanent deployment, and they want basically to fight against every enemy of Israel throughout the region.
Which does not, which includes Turkey. So maybe,
Right.
maybe Israel would like Turkey to be confronted. I doubt that. Certainly they don't want the Kurds to be slaughtered because they've been an ally of Israel. As'ad, thank you for joining us, and
Thank
we'll
you
be
very
talking
much
to you
for
again.
inviting me.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.